Well, hello to you wherever you're listening from. My name is Phil Dye and you're listening to Filtered, where we look at the issues that are affecting Australian society. And today we're looking at news media and how the news that you read, listen to or watch may not always be 100% truthful.
It's no secret that sometimes the things we read, hear or see can be, well, not entirely true.
Have you ever seen someone make a judgment before all the facts are in? It may have been bias.
So what's missing at the ABC is viewpoint diversity, and no one recognises that.
This is a story that makes you wonder sometimes if what you read, what you hear in the media is really true at all, and what the motivations are for some of the stories that pop up.
Yes, indeed it will, and be prepared. A little bit later I'll be interviewing Julie Szego, a journalist from Melbourne, prior writer for the Melbourne Age. But before we get to the interview with Julie, I wanted to outline a few issues that are happening in Australia's news media that may be contributing to certainly not a more informed and aware society, but a more divided one. Why am I so interested in this topic? Well, the first thing is that the news media shapes the thinking of us all. What we see on the news gives us our perspective of ourselves and the world in general. The second is that I managed a radio station on the south coast of New South Wales for many years. I have my second degree in media and communication. I then went on to lecture in media and communication at the University of Technology, Sydney, wrote for newspapers around Australia in the days when people read newspapers, and have an avid interest in this. The idea of news, think of the word news, N-E-W-S, what happens north, east, west and south, what happens on the points of the compass. And if we're looking at international news, we look at what's happening all over the world. If we look at Australian news, we look at what's happening in Australia. And I'll make the distinction here between public and private media. If we're looking at Sky News and the Herald and the Age and Channel 7, say, they're owned by private individuals or shareholders. We would hope that the news is objective, that it has integrity, that it's not influenced by outside organisations. But we know that commercial media receive revenue from advertisers, and some news editors may be reluctant to run a news story that's critical of one of their advertisers. They don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. However, in public media like the ABC and SBS, there's a charter that speaks of objective journalism and journalistic integrity. Journalism not influenced by outside organisations, and journalism not influenced by someone's opinion or personal feelings. It's these two components, objectivity and integrity, that is missing in our publicly funded news media. Now, in June this year, 2025, I analysed 70 articles from ABC Online that were talking about gender identity, transgender, non-binary, those sorts of issues, to see if it represented objective journalism. Now, these articles were only in ABC Online News. They were not in opinion. They were only in news articles online. There were 546 total articles in the period that I studied, but I focused in on 70 of them chosen at random. And these 70 were put through something called the All Sides Media Bias Checker. Now, that's not located in Australia, it's overseas, and I did that so that there wasn't any prior AI bias to do with the research. And in this study, which was not conducted by me, I didn't count it, All Sides did, it was found that ABC's news coverage was highly left-leaning towards progressive politics in the gender, transgender, non-binary space. Comments from the All Sides study included subjective adjectives, and that is where an adjective describes something but it's very emotional and it's personal. Opinion dressed up as fact. Another common descriptor was bias by omission. That's where only one side of the story was presented, but there was another side that was ignored. And while not part of the all sides data, it was clear that there were hundreds of news stories that didn't go along with a certain narrative that were totally ignored. Important news that disagreed with a certain point of view didn't get a look in. All of these things fly in the face of quality, objective journalism. And if we can't trust our ABC, that is funded through our taxes, to give us the news in a balanced way, who can we trust? In the report, which I don't think the ABC liked very much, I made 3 recommendations. The first was that those 70 articles which were analysed by the All Sides tool in depth be moved to an opinion section of the ABC site. I didn't say they should be wiped out, just moved to the opinion. The second thing was that any alliances that the ABC have with outside organisations be immediately cancelled. And those alliances include ACON, the AIDS Council of New South Wales, ACON's Pride in Diversity programs, including the Australian Workplace Equality Index, because joining those organisations and receiving awards from them for coverage of certain issues provides the opportunity for bias reporting, but it also gives the public the perception that there might be bias in the reporting. It's not just being objective and having journalistic integrity, it's being seen to be objective and having integrity. The third recommendation was that ABC management and news journalists, all the news staff, undertake anti-bias training. Not too much to ask, I would have thought. Now, a link to all of that research is in the episode notes. This research was sent to the ABC Ombudsman in the form of a complaint, and at the end of this episode I'll give you an update as to what the response has been so far. Ha! Wow, isn't that dramatic news introduction? On this subject, I managed to speak to Julie Szego. Julie is an ex-employee of the Melbourne Age, a popular media commentator in Australia. Julie, what's your experience of media censorship and bias?
Certainly I can say media censorship was something I experienced towards the end of my association with The Age. Where I worked, I've had an association with that paper on and off for about a quarter of a century. At the time when I encountered censorship, I was a weekly columnist at the paper, and I'd also been engaged to do a longer form piece on the subject of paediatric transition.
Julie, can you just explain that for people who may not be familiar with the term?
So kids being treated with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for a perceived alienation from their sex body, as we know, very controversial. At the time when I was commissioned to write about it was 2021, I believe, and it was a few months after the first Bell versus Tavistock decision, when the UK High Court found that kids under the age of 16 did not have legal capacity to consent to puberty blockers. I didn't know anything about this topic, neither did my editor really. She, at the time, just thought this is an interesting subject. It seems that Australia has a different approach to these issues to the UK. Sounds interesting. Perhaps you'd like to write about it. And I said, yeah, sounds interesting. Famous last words. When I started researching and writing a little bit on trans issues, that it was a highly toxic debate, the likes of which I couldn't wrap my head around.
And how did this compare with other topics that might have been contentious in the past?
It was like nothing I had seen before. And essentially, that's where I found myself censored as far as the story that I eventually wrote that didn't get in the paper. And in the end, I couldn't write, in fact, anything on this topic at all. At all.
Were you stopped completely from researching that topic and told just don't touch it?
More or less, I suppose. I wrote an op-ed here and there that was very, very mild, to my mind very mild, but one of them caused a big stir among trans activists, but I would later find out also among a section of the staff at the Age itself.
Right, so you've got activist staff members acting against you. What if you just wrote an opinion piece, so it was your opinion, not a news article?
There were several op-eds that I wrote on the subject, including one when Queensland was about to pass gender self-ID laws, which would essentially give anyone the right to change sex as a simple administrative process. And I was told there wasn't a news trigger, an appropriate news trigger for that piece to run. And I can't remember how many I had, but I had at least maybe half a dozen columns on the subject of trans one way or another that were censored, and sometimes even if there was just one paragraph about the trans debate in an otherwise entertaining and highly readable column, I was told no.
Was this a policy across the Age and Herald mastheads, or was this brought on purely by the editor and the other journalists in the newsroom?
Well, I don't know if it was a policy as such, but over a particular period of time, say, from when I first started paying attention to this issue, so 2021 to 2023, I can think of only one proper reported piece in the Sydney Morning Herald on, say, the subject of paediatric transition treatment for gender dysphoria. I can think of one, and all it was saying there's a bit of a debate and this is what some psychiatrists think about it, and they dissent from the mainstream orthodox medical view. So I guess if you look at it statistically, there was probably no explicit policy, but nor was there much space for proper reporting, proper critical reporting on the issue. And in that time, however, there were countless number of what we might call pro-trans pieces.
And interestingly, Julie, the Melbourne Age has not covered the recent Giggle versus Tickle case, the case that will define what a woman is in Australia, a case that will state whether there's women-only spaces allowed, whether women can play sports without men being in the opposing team, the most important court case in Australia in the last 10 years, and neither the Melbourne Age nor the ABC covered it.
Yeah. I mean that's extraordinary. And there was even a few months ago, there was an extraordinary judgment in the family court handed down by Judge Andrew Strum, where he questioned really sharply some of the central tenets of trans ideology, paediatric transition. Again, you wouldn't know about it unless you read The Australian.
Yes, bias by omission. Julie, what happened to you after all this sort of disagreement at the Age? I mean, it would have been a pretty hard place to work, I would have thought.
Well, I ended up being sacked basically from the Age over this issue. The reality is the relationship between myself and the Age had broken down over the censorship. But I know that I, in that sense, was merely the local chapter of a global problem, one of several journalists at progressive papers, journalists of a similar bent, lefties from way back, feminists, who came to grief on this issue. So Suzanne Moore at The Guardian is one of them. After she published again a pretty mild piece questioning some aspects of trans ideology, hundreds of her fellow Guardian journalists across the world, including in Australia, signed a petition not mentioning her by name, but saying that The Guardian should refrain from publishing so-called transphobic content. I mean, she obviously encountered there a pretty seriously hostile work environment and walked. Hadley Friedman is another journalist who found that she was just so censored at The Guardian that she also left. And there are several others as well in Canada and the US and elsewhere.
So what is being regarded as transphobic content is actually simply quality objective journalism. It's journalism that doesn't take a view one way or the other, but just covers the topic. But it's being labelled as transphobic. Now, you talked about your experience with The Age, but how widespread is this infection throughout the media generally?
Well, I think certainly we know that the ABC has an issue. Several times, Paul Barry, who used to anchor Media Watch, called the ABC out for the perception that its reporting was biased on this particular issue. When it reported at all, for the most part, it didn't.
Yes, Paul Barry from ABC's own program made a point of being critical of this issue. Let's have a listen to a little bit of what he said.
Emails obtained under FOI by a women's anti-trans group called ACON Exposed also show ACON's ABC relationship manager offered editorial tips. And emails from 2020, obtained under FOI, show an ABC journalist seeking and receiving advice from ACON on the correct definition of the word family. We also noted that the ABC had ignored legitimate medical debate about caution and safeguards in treating gender dysphoria in children. And last week there was criticism of another story from April this year on transgender athletes in women's sport.
ABC chairwoman Ita Buttrose said she regrets serious editorial lapses in a misleading ABC story about trans women in sport, which did not include research that showed they can retain physical advantages.
Now, we have not conducted a full audit of the ABC's editorial coverage, but the concern here is that it is not impartial, but one-sided. The problem here is a media group partnering with and being rewarded by a lobby group, any lobby group, and how that can lead to perceptions of bias in coverage or to bias itself. We think the ABC should review the arrangement.
Now, that was from a couple of years back. And thank you to the ABC for providing that via YouTube. But as I found out through my study, this is still going on. If it's not biased reporting, it's a bias by omission. It's simply not reported where there is something of international value, news value. The editorial director at the ABC is Gavin Fang. I've asked him to come onto this podcast, but he declined. He is the ex-director of diversity, equity, inclusion at the ABC. He's also, together with his role as editorial director, he is the director of inclusion. And I'm not trying to be critical in a negative sense, but constructive, really, in this critique. That I would not like to have Gavin Fang's position, because you cannot serve two masters. One master, the master of diversity, equity and inclusion, demanding adherence to LGBTQA principles. The other master being the master of objective journalism, where journalists have to weigh both sides of a story and give out all of the facts. This is not happening. It could also be that Gavin Fang is so busy wearing the two hats that he wears, that the foot soldier journalists who are writing the online news reports are just taking liberties with the facts or ignoring some of the facts. In which case, the inmates are most certainly running the asylum. Now, Julie, my research was on the ABC in relation to news reporting on LGBTQA issues. What are some of the other issues that are censored or clipped or subjectively reported in Australian media?
Yeah, I make a bit of a distinction between, there are others, and I'll get to that, but I probably make a bit of a distinction between biased or slanted reporting and what I encountered in the trans debate. So we're used to seeing a degree of polarisation in the media, and it's become much worse over recent years than it has been, but to a degree. You always expect Murdoch papers to lean a particular way, to lean towards the right on various issues, certainly at election time, and for progressive papers to lean the other way. So it's not necessarily a question of slant or bias, it's beyond that. it's a situation where media simply don't report a particular subject if it threatens some pre-existing meta-narrative, right? Don't admit that there's even a story there. That kind of thing, you know, pretending that issues that are deeply contested are settled, that's the new part of it that I haven't seen before.
So it's censorship or bias by omission. So if you don't cover an important story, there's a percentage of the public who don't even know about it, who don't even realise that there is a problem. And it's also that unchecked comments by, say, the Prime Minister when he recently said, most Australians overwhelmingly support a Palestinian state. Well, how does he know that? There's been no research on it. Australians haven't been asked about it. It's as if we have to simply accept what's being said.
I don't think we've ever had a situation quite before where if you relied exclusively on your news, say, from the Australian and Sky News, versus if you relied exclusively for your news on the ABC and The Guardian, or to some degree the Sydney Morning Herald, you would inhabit completely different worlds and you would have a completely different view of reality. That's also, I think, quite pronounced on the Gaza conflict, where there is to some degree a similar kind of dynamic. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same, but there is a similar sort of negation in parts of the progressive press that there is even a debate to be had about particular things. For example, whether Israel does or does not deliberately assassinate journalists in Gaza, that I have noticed.
And also the degree of starvation in Gaza and how it's represented is certainly different on the ABC compared to Sky News.
Yes, that's right. And I saw there's been an extraordinary piece written by someone, a journalist who I really admire, called Mutty Friedman, and he writes for the Free Press. And he has been writing for a long time on the media's, what he sees as the media's flaws in reporting the Middle East. He lives in Israel himself. He's a Canadian-Israeli journalist. But interestingly, he wrote a piece recently where he realised that the entire nature of the industry had changed and the way journalists saw their mission had changed. It's not just reporting the story, but to being very sensitive to where a particular story might land in the grand scheme of things and whose interests it might serve. So adhering to that meta-narrative of good, evil, oppressor, oppressed that I alluded to before. And he said, and he had done all this research on Israel-Palestine and thought, well, the media has just got a problem in this particular area. And he said that now, since the current Gaza war and since he's read more, he now realises that it's a problem across the board. It's not just in these areas, right? That there is a kind of more activist posture in the media. And he mentioned puberty blockers and trans debates as being one of them. And I suppose I've come at it, so I always knew that there were tensions around Israel, even when I was working at The Age many, many years ago. I think I've also come to the realisation of just how much it's not just this problem with trans, right? There is a problem across the board with campaigning journalism.
So this campaigning journalism that you talk about, is this a result of young journalists coming through a university system and they are actually being indoctrinated not to engage in objective journalism, but engage in social chain journalism?
That's an interesting question. When I took a voluntary redundancy from The Age in 2012, I taught for quite a number of years at the universities. Now, when I was there, I did not see that kind of change happening. I didn't see it happening yet in the journalism schools. But I think there's no doubt that if you look at the universities now and you look at the humanities departments generally, it'll be the place in society where you're least likely to encounter meaningful contestation, right? There is very little room for dissent from an orthodoxy that's almost religious on campus.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Only recently I looked up the course subjects, the course outline for the journalism and communication courses I used to teach in at UTS. And I discovered that there's a subject called communicating difference. And I'll just quickly read it to you, Julie. It says, you'll engage with case studies across media, policy and activism to understand racial, gender and class dynamics. You'll also develop projects that reflect on personal cultural identities and apply theories from critical media, race and feminist studies to professional contexts. And as far as I can see, there is nowhere mentioned objective journalism in any of the course outlines.
Another aspect of why activism has so infiltrated the profession is because of the universities, and universities being ground zero for particular ideologies and so on. But there's also just been a change in the business model of journalism where individual journalists have come to see themselves more as a brand, probably feel they need to be a brand because their jobs are insecure. There's mass casualisation and layoffs and so on in the media industry. And if they cultivate their own following, they may feel that they are sort of bulletproof, that they can kind of take their following with them if they happen to lose their job at a particular outlet. There is a kind of incentive to take a stand on issues, to be sort of strongly identifiable with particular causes and so on. I think Antoinette Lattouf is an example of that. And a lot of that kind of posturing and branding goes on social media. Social media is to blame for, I would say, 70% of our ills.
It's very hard to find a course at university now, from education to journalism to medicine, where activism is not actually a unit in those courses. I was at the University of New South Wales in the School of Medical Science, and I was amazed at how many students in medical science, often training to be doctors, actually believed that people could change sex. It was quite incredible.
Extraordinary. And I would even include things. I heard just a report the other day about a prestigious university where day one of a tutorial on, British history or something like that, the tutor begins with an extended acknowledgement of country. We are on land that has never been ceded and so on, look out the window. I mean, what does that mean for freedom of thought, academic freedom within the academy? Does that mean that indigeneity, that concept, can't be unpacked at all within what should be the safe space of a classroom? I think it's really troubling when anything like that happens at a university. And on the trans issue, we saw, Phil, after the infamous 2023 Let Women Speak rally at Melbourne University, the whole place was suddenly plastered with trans flags. There was a gender-critical feminist, she's still there, at the university. What did that do to her confidence and her freedom to scrutinise some of these ideas? Completely undermined her.
Well, it is a contentious issue. It's not something that's cut and dried. It is getting international discussion. These universities are simply social change agents nowadays. There's no unbiased education going on. I'm totally amazed by it.
I don't think that's exaggerated. I think that is entirely true. In the United States, we've seen that some people have gone to the extent of, in fact, starting up an entirely new university that is dedicated to free speech and inquiry and respectful debate and everything you think that the university was supposed to be, the traditional university.
Well, Australian universities sure ain't like that now.
podcast supports the right of women to play in single-sex sports without biological males in their team or playing against them. It supports the right of teachers, doctors, nurses, and any employee to openly state the truth that there are only two sexes and that it's impossible to change. If you're on the same page, put your name to the Declaration of Biological Truth Australia. It's free, fast, and 100% safe. You can also sign privately so your name won't show. It's for all Australians. Mums, dads, grandparents, and anyone who believes in reality. Just search for Declaration of Biological Truth Australia or follow the link in the episode notes.
Julie, there's a media outlet in the United States called Straight Arrow News, which, according to the All Sides Media Bias tool, is the only news source in the USA that is truly objective. In other words, you get quality, objective journalism. There's no personal viewpoints in there. Are there any media outlets that would rate as the same in Australia?
I don't know. And I guess I look for outlets that strive for the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient. A publication like Quillette, I think, is excellent. Sure, there are publications that I trust. I mean, I trust some of these mainstream publications as well. I still trust the ABC more than I trust some random blogger, right? I mean, there are things called standards, but I'm probably more likely to follow particular journalists than I am publications as a whole. There are still some very good journalists around, but I no longer attach any prestige to internationally, again, the New Yorker or something that I used to. I used to trust the brand. I don't trust any brand at all anymore. I mean, if we're looking at the gender issue particularly, I think the Australian does excellent coverage on it in terms of a mainstream paper. Also very sensitive coverage, I have to say, sometimes too sensitive, but it absolutely has fearlessly followed this story.
Yes, thank goodness for Bernard Lane.
Yeah, of course. Bernard Lane, he's not in the mainstream media. He started at the Australian, and he first got the Australian looking at the subject. Obviously, yes, he's by far the unrivaled leader in this area in Australia. It's pretty much the only journalist that has covered this issue in the way that it should be.
Julie, if this bias and slanted news reporting continues, and if the ideological capture of media outlets continues, what will happen to Australian society? What can we expect to see?
More division, more political polarisation, more public distrust of our institutions, because you can't fool the people. You can't pretend that there is nothing to see here in the trans debates. You can't pretend that there is no issue to debate if schools referring to your child by a different pronoun and letting your child use a different bathroom and you don't even know about it. That is a situation that is going to fester out there in the real world if doctors are still rolling out routine treatments that some of the most progressive countries overseas have put a break on. If the ABC and so on continues to downplay the debate or pretend there is none, effectively, it will just breed the kind of sort of distrust that we've seen building, I would say, since the era of Trump 1. I would say accelerated during the pandemic, and we're just going to see a lot more social division.
Julie, finally a sticky one. Every single human has a bias. We all see the world according to our own perception and our own experiences, which breeds in a sort of bias. And we've been saying that news journalists should suppress their individual feelings in favour of objectivity and truth. Is that humanly possible?
Yes. When I first started at The Age, around the turn of the century, I can put it in those terms now, Phil, there were still an old guard of journalists there who were from working class backgrounds, who had started at the paper straight out of school, and who had a view of their craft as being about telling a story with as much fidelity to truth and reality as they could muster. Right? So it was about representing reality as it is and not as they would like it to be. Over time, as we know, the journalism has become professionalised, and everybody who gets a job now at a paper has gone through the university. What's ground zero for activism and, like you say, indoctrination, the university.
Julie, it's been great talking with you.
Thanks, Phil.
And you can read all Julie's writing via Substack. There's a link to Julie's Substack page in the episode notes. I just love that news introduction. It seems like something so dramatic is going to happen, but really, it's not. I know I've been hard on the ABC over the last 35 minutes or so, but there are some really good eggs in the ABC. Nick Rheinberger from ABC Illawarra had this to say.
For now, plenty of people have been texting us about this situation, and it's fair to say that there are opinions on both sides, which is part of our role is to give you opinions on both sides if we can.
Yep, part of ABC's role is to give opinions on both sides if we can. The ABC generally is full of great people. There's some terrific presenters and journalists there. It's the ABC News division that I've been most critical about, and specifically ABC Online News. Now, what has been the response from the ABC so far about my study and the complaints? Well, I received an email from Fiona Cameron, the Ombudsman, who said that it was really beyond her remit because it was too broad. She's passed it on to the editorial director, Mr. Gavin Fang. Now, at the time of going to air with this episode, Gavin has 15 days to respond to me. If I don't get a response within that, I take that to the Australian Communications and Media Authority, because I believe, and I think most Australians believe, that this issue is not a small one. This is a very big issue about journalistic integrity and objectivity in news at the ABC. Now, we know that Paul Barry thinks it should be addressed. We know that Julie Szego thinks it should be addressed. And there's thousands of people who think the same. Thank you for listening. I'd really appreciate it if you could like this episode, or if you could share it, if you could make a comment. The more people can share, like, or comment, the more the algorithm will work in our favour. My email, if you want to contact me or make a comment, is phil@filtered.com.au. You can subscribe to Filtered for free on Substack. You don't have to pay anything, but it just means you do get the written updates as well. Just a quick addition, at the time of going to air with this, the Melbourne Age has now written an article about the Tickle v Giggle case. My name's Phil Dye. You've been listening to Filtered. See you next time.